So, good morning, everybody. It's so great to see so many people here, even after all of yesterday's parties. Our topic here today is the guests of honor and the books that influenced them. I'm Marianna, or Kisu, and I will be the moderator. And although at this point of the convention, this seems probably already kind of done for, I would still like to have my panelists start by introducing who they are. Can we start from the way at the other end?
Oh, they always do that, don't they?
Yeah. Oh, and on her left is, excuse me, it is Sunday. Oh, you're going to hear a lot of from all of us. My name is Ginger Buchanan. I'm one of your guests of honor, somewhere between editor and geezer fan, because Bill and Mary are the actual fan guests of honor, because I was always a very active fan, and then for 30 years I was an editor.
And I'm Diane Duane, and I'm probably the only person in this room who has been spanked because of Robert Heinlein. But we'll get into that in a bit.
Oh, good. Okay. I'm Bill Burns. I've been reading science fiction since the early 1950s, possibly more then than I read now, but still an avid reader.
And I'm Mary Burns. I first discovered science fiction in my granddad's garage, where he had some old astoundings. And we'll talk more about all the other books I've read since then.
Hi, I'm Ian MacDonald. I've been reading science fiction for quite a long time. I'm the embodiment of that great line by the Manic Street Preachers: "Libraries gave us power."
I'm Steve Jackson. I do games. I started reading science fiction in the late 50s, courtesy of my parents' subscription to Analog, and I didn't stop.
And actually, I do want to get us started going way, way back into what you just mentioned, into your childhoods. Did somebody read out loud to you? What were your family's attitudes towards reading?
Are we going to your far left again?
Yes, if we can. It's probably easiest that way. I can unfortunately barely see you there. So.
Well, it's by the way, I think this panel is an excellent idea, one that I was looking forward to. In my interview yesterday, I was asked that, my parents were older. My mother was 42 when I was born. They weren't read to the kids at bedtime sorts, although there were books around the house. My mother was a huge reader of mysteries. But I read as near as I could determine before I got to kindergarten. I know I could read when I got to kindergarten. And I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which has the largest and best free library system in the United States. It was endowed by Andrew Carnegie in a fit of robber baron guilt. Which he had reason to have. When I was old enough to get a library card, which was probably 8, I took 10 books out a week, which is what the maximum, and read through them and went down and got another 10. There was a branch in our neighborhood. So I never remember not reading. And I didn't quite hear the parameters of your question. Was it just how early did we start?
Basically, and maybe what did you read as a child?
Well, this is interesting. I was given to think about this because I knew some of the questions I was going to be asked yesterday. I gravitated in the aforementioned free library in the children's section to anything that looked like fantastical literature. A broader question, and perhaps a different panel, is psychohistory as to what attracted us to that, because there was no lack of children's books. My gateway book, and still one of my favorite books, was an American fantasist named Edward Agar, and there's a book called Knight's Castle. But I read all of him. I read all of Mary Poppins. I read all of C.S. Lewis. I read Mary Norton. I read anything that looked like fantastical literature. It was predominantly fantasy. There was very little kids' science fiction, at least back then. But just, I don't know why those books, and I'm not sure any of it, well, maybe some of us do know. I don't know why those books, but those books. And as I got older and moved clockwise through the library, from the children's section to the very small, what we would call now YA section, genre that didn't exist back then, or a subdivision, to the adult section, I continued to gravitate to those books. Through the fantasists to Door into Summer they had in the YA section, to Ray Bradbury, H.P. Lovecraft, and Shirley Jackson, at much younger than I should have been reading. Why? I don't know.
It's very strange. We have a lot of overlap. I was another really early reader. The first time I was accused correctly of reading, I was I was about 3. Well, no, the accusation went both ways. I knew I was reading at one point or another, and my father was not quite clear on the subject. And we're riding somewhere in the car, and I see a sign that says gas, as they say in the States, and I say, gas. My mother says, she read that. My dad says, no, she didn't. I said, G-A-S, gas.
Told him.
You know, look, I'm 3 years old and you canceled my ticket already. What the hell is this? So anyway, as soon as I realized that there were like places you could go to read and get away from the people who thought you weren't doing that, the local library had a good children's section. I burned through that pretty quickly. And there was a lot of Edith Nesbit.
Oh,
I think I started with her, one of the most dangerously subversive writers for children ever seen. And, you know, after Nesbit.
Or as she was wrote as E. Nesbit.
E. Nesbit, absolutely. Yes. And then Andre Norton, and this was sort of the golden age of the Norton juvenile. So, you know, the actual language might have been a little bit you know, fussy or stilted in terms of her tone, but the ideas were mind-blowing. I think that was my first collision with the concept of world gates, and I've been playing with world gates ever since. It's like, you know, you can't keep me out of them. And then, you know, in the midst of this binge of Andre Norton, I ran across this Heinlein person, and I went, oh, Starship Troopers, what's that? I was 8. And I blew through it, I burned through it in an afternoon, right? And I came out of it, it's like, whoa, the world has changed. And I went home and I said to my parents, I said, do you know that all wars are caused by population pressure? And my dad says, no, they're not. And I said, yeah, they are. And he says, no, they're not. And I said, yeah, they are. So he spanked me. All right. And you know what?
That's why you were spanked.
And that's why I was spanked, because Robert Heinlein got me spanked. And you know, you have to be careful how you phrase this.
Foreshadowing.
And when I was able to meet him much later and tell him about this, and he just said, I'm so sorry, you know. I said, no, it's all right. Look how it turned out. So
I'm sorry, but my family, there was absolutely no oversight on what I was reading. Absolutely. For good or ill, actually, because I'm not sure if a kid of my age should have been reading Shirley Jackson, but who I love, by the way. Love. So I didn't have that problem. No one ever spanked me.
I got around it. After that, there was some pushback. There was some pushback, and my dad said, she is not to read those books in the library anymore. Yeah, okay. I went to a different library.
See how well that worked.
Really.
My mother belonged to the Detective Book of the Month Club, and she let me read freely what came in. And again, you know, I'm not sure that a child of my age should have been reading Nio Marsh. You may not know who she is, but they were pretty not rough in the hard-boiled sense, but they had some adult material. But they were just happy, both of them, I think. My dad was more of a newspaper that I was reading. So I have my sympathy to you, Miss Twain.
Thank you. Accepted.
So I grew up in a suburb of Manchester in the early 1950s, and we didn't have a lot of books in the house, I suspect because my parents couldn't afford many books at the time. But I had 2 older brothers, and quite a bit older, and they were reading to me and basically taught me to read before I went to primary school. And I don't remember anything I read that early, but I do remember where we lived at the time. we also had an Andrew Carnegie Free Library, and they're all over
Yeah.
England and Scotland, Wales. I don't know about Ireland.
He was
a lot of
really
guilt.
guilty.
Yeah,
really
and I
guilty.
had no idea who he was until much later, and that library is still there, but the library was at the end of our street, which was very handy. So even as a small child, I was able to walk to the library, and I was there so often, we're going to make you a monitor, you can shelve books when you're here, you know. So they actually made me work for my books there. I was probably 6 or 7 at the time. But I started, again, there wasn't that much choice in the early 1950s. There were the Kemlo books by E.C. Eliot with dreadful science but fun stories. Yeah. And oddly, every character had, their name began with K. I wonder if that's where the Kardashians got the idea. So there's Crilly and Kemlo and I forget all the other names, but they had one name. And the premise of this, really strange, but it was interesting, was that these kids were raised in a vacuum and they didn't need air to breathe. In fact, they couldn't breathe air. And there was some mysterious, ethereal substance out in space that kept them alive. And if they came down to Earth, they had to wear a suit. So the air didn't kill them. But and it was just really, kids' adventures moved to space. But they were fun. And then we also had the Hardy Boys, a very strange thing to read in England. Very American
It's true, though. Yeah.
series produced by a syndicate. Franklin W. Dixon was the author, but that was actually a bunch of people who the syndicate owners just contracted for, I don't know, a few
Stratemeyer, it was called.
Yeah, a few $100s a book, and you gave up all of your rights. You couldn't ever say you'd written them. But they were fun stories again.
They were Nancy Drew and a whole lot of other stuff.
Yeah, the Bobbsey twins, I think, was part of that. So really, there wasn't really a lot of science fiction in the children's section, if any. I don't recall any. But then when I was around 9, we moved to another house, and there was another library there, fortunately, just near the bus stop. And there, I think the first book I remember is Starman Jones by Heinlein.
Yeah.
Where the kid gets on the spaceship and saves the day. And so I read through whatever books they had in the children's section, and then they said, you might as well have an adult card, And again, probably pulled 1 or 2 books off the shelves that wasn't sure about them. But I don't remember any other specific books, but I certainly read my way through everything they had. And just kept reading after that.
Well, my parents and my grandparents always read to me and my siblings as we were growing up. Indeed, as I got a bit older, I started reading to my siblings as well. In the early days, I was really, from the time I started reading actual novels, I was reading horse stories, because I think a lot of girls were just horse mad. So Walter Farley, all of those, Black Stallion and the Island Stallion and that. And then I ran out of those, so then I started reading some historical fiction. And we also had a Richard's Topical Encyclopedia. And of course, I read everything about the dinosaurs, and then I had to get into the bees and things like that. That was a nice, easily readable encyclopedia with a lot of information in it. When I was 8 years old, my mother had to go to the library because they wouldn't let me take out anything but what I considered to be baby books. The books with all the pictures in it. No, I want the words. Please give me the words. It takes away from the story. So, and then about 1958 is when I discovered my granddad's stash of old astoundings, and I read through those. But didn't really understand what science fiction was at that point until about 1960 when I went to high school. And we had 3 novels. One of them was The Red Planet by Heinlein, and was probably the first full science fiction novel I read. And we had a librarian who really liked science fiction. So by the time I graduated from high school, we had a library with several hundred science fiction novels in it because she ordered them. And of course, every time she got a new one, she had a waiting list for it, because I guess a lot of my schoolmates also liked science fiction.
Can I I'm sorry if I can. I pointed out on another panel, Mary, that reading stories about a kid that has a black stallion in his backyard in Queens is also science fiction. I read all, it's certainly fantasy. I read all the Walter Farleys too, but if you think about it, they are equally fantasy.
Yeah. It's escapist literature.
Yes.
Wish fulfillment.
My family weren't really great readers, but we were read to with lovely picture books, some of which I can remember as a child. vividly because I'm quite a visual person. But my mum had a friend. I was born actually in a suburb of Manchester, and we moved back to Northern Ireland when I was 5. My mum had a very good friend, a heroic woman called Bess Cotton, who was basically a superpowered health worker, brought healthcare to bits of Manchester that weren't getting it, and was an all-around good person and a big book fan. And she was my book mentor. She would send me little rescue packages of books she thought I would like. And I remember things like The 35th of May by a guy called Eric Kastner was one. A New English Library did these. She sent me The Phantom Tollbooth, great book. And Diane will nod in agreement. And she sent me, I can never remember the name of the writer, but she sent me Uncle.
Yes.
Which was for, for an 8 or 9, for a 7 or 8-year-old kid, this is anarchy in its purest form. This
Really?
is serious stuff. Wonderful books. Marcus from GoHs, actually, big Uncle fan, and has done collector's editions of them as well. Great, wonderful books. And for that, from that, these were like my gateway drug. These kind of book parcels I'd be sent from Manchester by Bess. Then we had a thing called the Scoop Club in school, where you paid a bit of money. My mum by then knew it was too late for me. I was a reader. I wasn't the sporty one. I never would be. I was a reader. And we joined this thing called the Scoop Club, where you paid a subscription and you could pick books from a list of books. And by then, the fantastic was drawing at me. Bess also sent me all the Moomin Troll books as well, which were deeply wonderful and very, very affecting. And I saw these. Scoop Club had a decent amount of science fiction books. Angus MacVicar, if I remember right. The Supernova, which were great books. Yeah, I only did 2 of them, as far as I know. It was a space lifeboat based in Port Imbrium on the moon, and they basically went on rescue missions where things went wrong or bad shit happened. You sent the Supernova space lifeboat to rescue people, which is a really good premise. And from them, I moved into Captain W.E. Johns and Biggles. And also, he wrote a lot of really weird sci-fi as well, set in the asteroid belt.
All the science fiction was weird, wasn't it?
It was.
The phenomenal children's science fiction.
Kevlar, what? Yes,
and Professor A.M. Lowe with Adrift in the Stratosphere.
I devoured these in the children's library, and there they all were. Then I too made the jump to the adult library, and I discovered a great thing, which was GoHs used to do all their science fiction with yellow covers.
Oh, yeah.
And that made it so simple. You just worked your way through all the yellow spines in the library, and you would have a complete science fictional education. And of course, there was stuff that was way too old for me or way too sophisticated, but I read my way through all those books. And then the day came when I had enough money to go to a very good bookshop in Bangor, the small town where I kind of grew up. There's a very good little bookshop with a well-stacked science fiction section, and thought it is time to buy my own book for myself with my own money. And I bought the Hugo Winners, Volume 1, Volume 2, the one with the green cover, the one with the orange cover, edited by Isaac Asimov, and that was it.
Well, my parents were very much readers and had a lot of magazine subscriptions and encouraged me to read and did not try to put any brakes on what I read. I cannot remember not being able to read. I was an early voracious reader. They had a subscription to Analog, so I broke in on short stories. The wait between installments of a serialized novel was just intolerable. just unbearable. I had the same sort of experience at the Carnegie Library and was hugely frustrated that the children's section was not larger than it was, and that they were so fierce about not letting the children go shopping in the adult section. They you know how library editions are rebound, and they drew a little rocket on the back of all the science fiction stories. That made them easy to spot, and it was very easy to see what I was missing. But yes, like the rest of our panel, eventually I graduated into that. My elementary school had a very good library and a very good children's librarian, and that was almost certainly where I encountered Heinlein. I know that was where I read Starship Troopers. I also went through everything by Norton that I could find. Anderson, E.E. Smith, it was all out there, and it was very, very wonderful. I should throw out a couple of obscure titles just to see if anyone recognizes them. I meant to do this. Does anyone remember The Mushroom Planet, Basidium?
Gosh, yes.
That was the only, Stowaway to the Mushroom Planet was in my little children's, the only science fiction. Remember, I'm older, so it was pre-Andre Norton, and the only thing that you would call science fiction, the rest was fantasies, was Stowaway. But there are several other Mushroom Planet books, and I think, and they only had Stowaway. So I read Stowaway, and there was nothing else.
How about the dinosaur sci-fi crossover in the children's section, Oliver Butterworth's The Enormous Egg?
Yes, I read that.
Good for you, Dan.
2 points to Diane.
I keep hearing things I know, it's great.
Wow. So as a sort of a summary, I would say we could say yay to libraries. Those are a good thing indeed. And
Stay around.
Yes, exactly. They should stay around.
We should also say, thank God Andrew Carnegie was such a miserable,
But repented.
repented.
Yeah.
But moving on a little bit, because you have obviously all done great things, but has there been a book or a piece of work, let's put it that way, that made you realize that, okay, wow, this is what I want to do. I want to be an editor, an author, a fan, a game designer. Was there like a sort of a seminal work which really affected you, your brain, made you realize, okay, I can, and more importantly, I want to do this?
Tough question.
I'm just wondering if anybody has an answer ready, we can start with that. I think, Steve, you mentioned before that you might have.
Yes, I think probably the moment that I realized, hey, I could do this, was when I watched the first episode of the original Star Trek. That was one thought that I had as I watched that, and the other was this television show has changed everything. That was obvious in the first 15 minutes of the Attack of the Salt Vampire. It was things are different now.
Yeah, I hid from that one.
A lot of NASA people today have said they got interested in space because of science fiction, and quite a few of them because of Star Trek. My influence had to be earlier than that. I went to university in 1965, so I was committed to my career before there was Star Trek. But I had two older brothers who were in chemistry, a research chemist and a chemical engineer, and I was the rebel of the family. I went into electronics, and I was like hard science fiction, perhaps unsurprisingly. So I don't know what the influence was that led me into a technical career, but are you wired that way so you enjoy science fiction and technical things, or does science fiction encourage a latent interest in something? I don't know if there have been any studies on it. I certainly couldn't say. But
You know what?
I'm sorry.
No.
When I was going to college and then to graduate school, it was still at a point in time where there were only a handful of acceptable careers for women. And I started out to be a teacher and wound up being a social worker. So it never occurred to me that I could be an editor. There was a journalism department in the university I went to, but it was more newspaper journalism and things like that. I didn't realize that until I moved to New York and became part of the community of science fiction fandom, which also includes
Editors.
science fiction editors. And that was when I began to realize that there was another path. There is the alternate universe where I started out as an editor and became a social worker when I was 40. But so I saw that people were doing it. I saw what they were doing. I thought I could do this, and not only that, I could make a living doing it, as opposed to I have to go to college to get into a career that I can make a living at. I'm of that generation. So I don't think it was a book or anything. I think it was being a member of this community that actually, literally, in using that word right, profoundly changed the direction of my life.
I would say for me it came in stages, and the giveaway is always, what fanfic am I writing? Now, at the time, I didn't even know that was what it was called. I didn't know it had a name. I found out later. But when Star Trek came out, certainly that was a crystallizing moment, and suddenly I'm writing all this Star Trek fan fiction. Terrible, terrible Star Trek fan. All burned now, thank God, a long time ago, right? Oh, but
That's
it
what
was
you think.
awful.
Future Diane Duane scholars are going to be upset.
And then, okay, so some years go by, and the Tolkien bug bit me, all right? So the Fellowship. And I would have been in nursing school at that point, writing, some what was halfway between Tolkien fanfic and something else I was feeling my way toward, where there was this kind of fire or something, right? And somewhere in there, all that was remaining, all that needed to happen to light the match to the fuse was to see someone else writing. And so when I left nursing in New York and moved to LA for a while, the intention at that point was to do private duty nursing for a while because I was burning out in psychiatry. And I went out there and I became David Gerald's assistant for a year or so. And I watched him writing books. I said, this doesn't look like it's not doable. I mean, people could write this. And so I said, one day, took my courage in my hands. I said, David, I think I want to be a writer. And he went, oh, God, not another one.
Ever helpful, yeah.
Yeah, really? No, it's right. He knew what he was doing. This is conscious. He knew what, not that many people know, but I have a little bit of a temper, just a little bit. And so, I just walked away quietly, and the thought balloon above my head was filled with the things you don't say. And mostly it was filled with you, SOB. I am going to show you I am not one of them. I'm just not another of them. You're going to find out real quick. And while I was working with him, I wrote the initial draft of The Door into Fire, and then showed it to him. He caught me at it. I thought I was hiding my tracks. I wasn't well enough. He caught me at it. He read a page or two of what I thought I'd thrown away securely but hadn't. And he said, this is actually not bad. Let me see it when it's done, and we'll see if anybody's interested in publishing it. So
Been his plan all along.
yeah,
He's a devious
man, he's a devious guy, old friend.
Did you
So-
go into nursing because it was one of the acceptable careers for women?
No, I went into nursing because I couldn't get into astrophysics.
Oh, okay.
I won a New York State Science and Regents scholarship a Regents scholarship in science and nursing. And I went to Dowling College out in Oakdale on the island for a year and discovered that calculus and I were not suited for each other. And if I couldn't make it past calculus, I was not going to be a professional astrophysicist. So I said, well, I can't use the science half of this, I may as well use the nursing half. So off I went the next year to Pilgrim State Hospital School of Nursing in Brentwood. Yeah, and graduated 3 years with a specialty in psych, which is a great prep for being a writer, because at the end of the day, it's all about motivation for your characters, and so is psychiatry, really.
Yeah, we were talking about this. Yes.
Yeah, so that's how that happened.
Like,
Ian?
yeah, I was going to say, like Lion, I wrote fanfic without actually knowing what it was at that time. And I had that kind of thing. I would write it and then change it because I wasn't quite happy with that character or how the starship worked, or how the the aliens were, and it kind of migrated away little bit by little bit from being fanfic into my own ideas and my own adventures, still with a very, very heavy overlay of Star Trek over the whole thing. But little by little, I was moving it towards how you know, to the characters I wanted to use and the worlds I wanted to explore and the games I wanted to play with this particular world. And I think for me it was, the sequence was, I want to do that, and then I can do that, rather than I can do that, I want to do that. I remember reading lots of short fiction. Harlan Ellison, who, for all his faults, was a hell of a story writer, and reading and working out how he did what he did, how the voice worked, where the beats lie, where he would basically, you know, knee you in the balls, basically, to trigger a shock effect, basically, and then change the tone completely. I remember kind of how was he doing that and analyzing that, and then at the sort of Deathbird stories, anyone read Deathbird? There's a warning that says, do not read all these stories in one go. I did.
And live to tell the tale.
But by the end of it, I had a tiny bit of the mind of probably one of the US's greatest story writers of the 20th century. And then thought, right, I think I can do this now. And off I went. Like that.
Very good. So I'd say, you know, I started reading fantasy and science fiction a lot once I got into high school. And of course, one of the books was Starship Troopers. Now, this has an underlying premise that you should give back. You know, you shouldn't be a citizen if you're not willing to put your life on the line for your world or your country. So I joined the Marines. And Bill can tell you, I'm in a lot of community service stuff at home because I think that you can't just live in this little house and this is all you've got. You've got to be out there, you know, doing things and helping other people. So I think that it's had a pretty profound effect on my life.
You might have done that anyway, but...
I think that certainly helped, and there's things like my politics, you know, I hate Trump. Because he's not a Republican. He's not a real Republican, because people have got to remember that Lincoln, well, we'll get off that. That's a stupid topic. But Murray Leinster, I think it was, had the inalienable basic, you know, everybody should have enough to live on. It's not going to give you a great lifestyle. If you want more, you got to work for it. But nobody should go hungry. Nobody should go without shelter. And that's, you know, that's also something that has affected my attitude.
Seen as very radical these days, isn't it?
I know.
Yeah, sadly.
But there are some of our presidential candidates who are proposing this kind of thing.
Universal basic income.
Yeah.
I unearthed, or actually my husband unearthed, because we were doing some cleaning up, a paper I wrote in undergraduate school for a sociology course, which is basically a science fictional look at the future of monogamous marriage, which was informed by, you know, the science fiction I was reading then.
So yeah, now we've kind of covered the basics where you got started, but when you think about your biggest accomplishments, literary, fandom, gaming, and you get to define them, I'm not gonna, what were the things that influenced them? Can you point out exactly the books that influenced them, or were there several influences, or did it just all come out of the thin air, so to speak?
Well, I think editors have a dual charge or a dual responsibility, depending on how you look at it. Editors who work for mainstream, in mainstream publishing. I went from working in the nonprofit, I was a social worker in foster care and adoption, to working in a business. Publishing is a business. And the dual thing is to buy books that will sell, because publishing is a business. But also, I think we all buy the books that we like. And that is the connection. If you read a certain kind of science fiction or a certain kind of fantasy, or were particularly fond of the writing style of a certain kind, you would, as an editor, you're likely to respond to that when you see it in a manuscript, whether consciously or unconsciously. And I think that that is the connection. I'm not saying that I wound up buying a lot of Edward Egger. I was not in a young adult. And although I did a lot of the science fiction at Ace, I did like a certain kind of fantasy. And it became known as urban fantasy. Ace was the imprint in the United States that between our imprint and our romance imprint, which we're doing paranormal romance, we kind of, for good or ill, invented that as a subgenre. And a lot of that came out of, and you can, praise or excoriate me for that, came out of my tastes. I liked that kind of thing that was the Ursula, I think, called it the fairies in the bottom of the garden. I liked the kinds of things that Charles DeLint was doing. The thing where the world of the supernatural or fae or whatever intersects in some way with our world, which is what the Edward Eggers and Ian Nisbets did. And I liked that a great deal. And I gravitated towards buying those kinds of books. And at that point, it wasn't a big thing, but I liked them. And Ace had a big enough list that I could buy them and we could publish them. And it became a major subgenre in the field for a number of years and launched many, many careers, some of which are still going quite strong. Jim Butcher. Now, Harry Dresden is the only wizard in the phone book in Chicago. That's just kind of an adult version of the things I was reading, when I was 8 years old in a way. So I think that is my feeling about it as an editor. So I'll turn it over to the writers.
The connection at the writing end is interesting because the influence of the things you loved to read. I mean, for those of us who work both at the fantasy and at the science fiction ends, if it's a spectrum. I mean, we'll just assume it is. Certainly the fantasy end for me was always deeply influenced by everything that was going on in the Ballantine SF series, the great classic paperback series. The science fiction end has always been, the effects besides Heinlein, God knows, E.E. Doc Smith, that feeling, that sort of Band of Brothers feeling of, lots of alien species working together toward a common goal, that has deeply underwritten the Young Wizards universe. I didn't see any reason why wizardry should stop at atmosphere. And so we have all these cool aliens who are also wizards. I mean, their understanding or version of the wizard's oath may be wildly different from yours, but we are all doing the same job. We're trying to keep entropy from being more of a nuisance than it has to be. At the SF end, that influence is there as well, though what Star Trek fiction I write has been always influenced more by the Heinleinian, the harder science end. It's like I like to take Star Trek and shove in the science they forgot about, because it's stronger for it, not worse. And so that goes. You put into your new books the things you liked in the old ones. That's the way it went for me anyway. Yeah.
It's interesting that in order to be a guest of honor at a World Science Fiction Convention, you tend to be of a certain age. And we're all talking about our influences, and I know a lot of these books are out of print now.
Sure.
I'm sure Doc Smith is hardly read, even Heinlein, Asimov.
Oh, you can get
Arthur
them in
C. Clarke.
Golank's Masterworks?
Yeah, that's because of Malcolm Edwards. I was a fan.
with all the letters.
They did a really,
I wonder how
Malcolm
many
did a
people are
really
still
great job.
reading these, and the field is so much more diverse now. There are far many more and different influences on people. When we were growing up and reading science fiction, there was really a limited amount you could find.
Yeah.
There was nothing like the diversity there is today. But anyway, that's a sidetrack. Obviously, I'm not a writer. I'm a pretty good technical writer. I have no idea how you write fiction. I just can't believe how you guys do it. It's a complete mystery to me.
We're not always sure either.
Okay, good. That makes me,
Mostly we make it up.
But for me, the influence was not science fiction itself, but fandom. Science fiction fandom, people say it's just another fandom. I don't think it is. I think there's something different about science fiction fandom, particularly from the early days, where there were traditions. It was, as people have said, it was something that you were kind of strange. If you read science fiction in the 50s, that was a very odd thing to do. You kind of hid the books and so on. So fans perhaps gathered because of that to some extent. But the fanish traditions and the atmosphere in fandom and still today, I think, is that it's a community. It's not just a bunch of people that pay money to go to a show, and they pay for photographs, they pay for autographs, they queue to get in panels, although sorry about that here. But it's much more of a community. As you probably all know, the Worldcon is run entirely by volunteers, and I think that's possibly unique in the convention production. The Worldcon and other science fiction conventions, obviously EasterCon in England, and many of the regional conventions. But in terms of large conventions, I think Worldcon is unique in that there is no profit motive anywhere. And that sense of community, I think, is what drove me, as Mary mentioned, on some of the things she has done, to work on conventions. I have the website efanzines.com, so that people who want to publish fanzines but can't afford postage or printing costs can produce fanzines. And all this is done without any thought of a profit motive or any cost at all. I think that's, to me, is one of the best things about science fiction fandom, which is driven by science fiction. Again, perhaps it's because of all those amazing things we read in the books, and the influence that's had on us has affected the way we run our lives to a certain extent.
I think that science fiction, when reading science fiction, you come from so many different premises and points of view. Each story says, if this is so, where will we go? Or here's this fantasy world, which is different from what we are. A little escapist, perhaps, but fun. And it leads, I think, to more of a flexibility of mind and a more acceptance of the differences between us. And that's how fans can come together from so many backgrounds, and we all have interests, some are the same, some are different, and we learn from each other. I think fans tend to be more open-minded and flexible than most of the outside world, what a lot of people call mundanes. People who are just in they're in their own track and that's it, and they just don't see everything else around them. Fans are, I think, a little more prone to looking at the whole world. And I think that's what science fiction has done for me. It's made me look a little bit, be more accepting of people who are different, and having an attitude that will not exclude anyone.
Growing up, always looked for, it's like I was saying about my Star Trek fan, I always pushed it somewhere else. And I've always looked for fiction that goes somewhere else, that doesn't hover, it doesn't orbit around the mainstream core, but goes somewhere else and does something strange, is on the edge of things. I mean, I grew up in Northern Ireland, which is a place on the edge, not on the main, not at the core, on the periphery of Ireland, periphery of the UK. I lived I lived not in Belfast, but in Bangor, a nice suburban town 14 miles away, on the edge of the Troubles. We couldn't even do the Troubles right in Bangor. So middle class. And I lived on a little suburban house on the very edge of Bangor, not in the core, but on the periphery of the periphery of the periphery of the periphery. And that kind of made me interested in things that aren't the core, that aren't like me, that are different in different ways. And I've always been drawn towards kind of other parts, the science fiction stories of other parts of the world, how these things happen in places that aren't like me, that are different, in other places that are seen as being peripheral to science fiction. When I was growing up, SF, the core was always the UFO was going to land on the White House lawn, occasionally hover over the Eiffel Tower, but it was never going to arrive over Caproni's and Seacliff Road in Bangor down. And that kind of made me look for other places that didn't seem quite, that seemed peripheral to science fiction. It kind of drove me that way. So I was taking stuff I loved about the genre, doing something different with it, pushing it somewhere else, playing around with it, making it not like me.
One wonderful thing about reading a lot is that you have, it gives you a lot of things to think about. Some of them I agreed with and some of them I didn't, but you can get a good story, a good whatever you're writing by disagreeing too. I know since I was raised on analog, one of my big early influences was the editorials of John W. Campbell. I have spent a lot of time trying to unlearn some of the things that he taught me, but he had had a lot of wisdom too. The stories that most directly affected my early work were the Keith Laumer Bolo stories and Colin Capp's, I believe it was novella length, Gotlos, because those both fed directly into the ogre game. Later on, when I was working on Car Wars, the idea was suggested by a friend, but I found that there were some very good stories out there. Harlan Ellison and Alan Dean Foster spring to mind, writing about, well, what would happen if we stuck guns on cars? So it's interesting to see the master's take on these things. And since then, I just keep reading. The cross-world stories of Bean Piper have influenced a lot of what I have wanted my games to be. The ability to jump and combine genres in a game is very closely related to the ability to walk through a gate and be somewhen or somewhere else.
Really interesting. And well, my next question is going, well, not off tangent at all, but kind of picking up on what Bill mentioned there before, that today there is so much to choose from. There is a lot more diversity in what can influence us. And even though the topic is the books that influenced you, I would like to ask you about the books that are influencing you right now. Yes, there is the past tense in the panel title, but I'm sure the audience won't mind if we talk a little bit about the present day as well.
I will sidestep around that. I retired. I retired about 6 years ago, and I find myself reading much more broadly out of the field now because I'm not working. But what I want to say is, building on what I had just said about my experience that informed what I did as an editor, when the concerns are raised about us being a field that isn't diverse enough in terms of the writers, it isn't diverse enough in terms of the world building, it isn't diverse enough in terms of character. I don't mean to be glib about this, but this is taking care of itself. There are more and more and more people of more and more diverse backgrounds reading science fiction and fantasy. They're going to pull out of the library as 10-year-olds books that didn't exist when I was a 10-year-old. They're going to grow up reading these new diverse writers who are doing these kinds of things. They are going to become the editors of the future. They're going to become the 30 or 40-year-old me, and then they will be looking for those things that they read when they were 10-year-olds that weren't necessarily written by a bunch of old white guys, which includes Diane. But I do think that wheel is turning. That we are worried about getting there, but I don't actually think that we need to be worried about getting there, although I understand why people are. Sure. That isn't necessarily an answer to your question, although it is in a way, because I am now reading myself some of these new voices, the not necessarily younger writers, but people that are bringing into the field, different backgrounds, not just fantasy, also in science fiction, different ways of looking at things, and I think that it's a great thing that's happening, but I don't feel it needs to be forced. It's going to happen. This genre, speculative fiction is no longer fringy. I mean, what Bill was saying, in the 50s, if you read science fiction, you were weird. It's no longer fringy. We haven't won, people say that, because it wasn't a battle. We are now a part of the culture, and this bodes extraordinarily well for the future. Again, not necessarily an answer to your question, but I wanted to say that. Over to you, Diane.
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing for me right now is not just the diversity of voices that we're seeing so much more of, which is so brilliant. But diversity of styles, I'm seeing stuff that would have been considered wildly experimental when I started out, just non-linear storytelling or, just tours de force, like, Cat Valenti's space opera, where, she takes an entire bag, all the science fiction tropes, empties them onto the table and starts hitting them with a stick.
I
It's the best
edited
thing,
2 books
Yeah.
by Charlie Strauss that he
Yeah.
told entirely
Yeah.
in second person.
Yes, really.
Diane, I
And,
want to read that story. Can you tell me the name and author again?
Cat Valenti, space opera.
Space opera.
Oh, sit down, pour yourself a drink. You're going to have a party. But yeah, stuff like that. Go. Yeah.
I find I don't read as much science fiction as I used to, perhaps because it's so diverse and there's so much of it. Where do you begin? What do you pick up? You read reviews, and some people like it, some people don't like it. But there's just so much of it. And I'm also kind of averse to reading books where you get to the end and it says to be continued.
Oh, Bill, that makes us old.
I know. When you got a book from the library or bought a book and it was 200 pages, you could read it in an evening if you're a fast reader. And now you get a 1,000-page book and you work your way through it and, this is book 1 of 5. And the story doesn't end here. I'm not talking about series where they're set in the same universe and each book is a standalone.
Yeah.
But I've not read a single volume of Game of Thrones, for example.
You're waiting.
No, I'm just not going to read it.
Oh, okay.
Possibly, because by the time it's finished, it'll be too overwhelming.
I got you.
So I'm still looking for good standalone books. I read Andy Weir's The Martian. It's brilliant. Robin Sloan in San Francisco writes some interesting stuff. It's Penumbra's 24-hour bookshop. And recently Sourdough, about the guys from Eastern Europe who set up a sourdough shop in San Francisco, and the sourdough is somehow sentient.
Okay.
And they're quirky things, really.
There's a new
I
original
still-
idea.
Yeah, I still like hard science fiction, but I like it to be a book I can pick up and read in a couple of days, maybe, and not make a lifelong commitment to it.
Yes. Well, I don't mind reading trilogies and that kind of thing. I did read Andy Weir's book, The Martian. It was a terrific book if you haven't read it. And Bill recommends books to me, and that's a good thing because there are so many out there, and how do you find the new authors? The other thing that's annoying is the library used to take the science fiction and put a little rocket ship on the back, and they don't do that anymore. Science fiction has gone mainstream.
That's it.
Except for the people who still disparage us a bit,
Yeah.
but there are still people out there who think, well, science fiction, that's that
Or
stuff.
if you read Dave Langford's Ansible newsletter, he has a little swib in there every issue called As Others See Us.
Yeah.
And these absurd statements about science fiction. People that clearly know nothing about it, but feel free to pontificate on it.
Right, because they've never read it. So, but I find that quite distressing, because I have trouble. That's one way I used to find the new authors was looking for that little rocket ship on the back of the books, and now I have to guess. It's an interesting title. I'll take it down and look. It's not science fiction. It's some romance or something. Okay, I disparage romance mostly, because there's some pretty good fantasy that's really sort of romance, but it's fantasy, So.
But they have read science fiction, Bill. They just don't realize they've read science fiction. The Martian was a huge bestseller, but if you asked, maybe 75% of the people who read The Martian, if they've ever read science fiction, they'd say no.
Yeah.
It's the old Kingsley Amos doggerel, isn't it? SF's no good, they bellow till we're deaf. Well, this looks good. Well, then it's not SF.
Yeah.
Dan was hinting, that we haven't won, but we have. Ultimately, we are the guardians of the new pantheon. If you go back and read Thomas Hardy, it's full of references back to the classical world that are meaningless to gods and tropes of the ancient Greeks. We are the creators and the high priests of the new mythology. We have our superheroes, we have our dragons. All these things are an evolving new mythology. And I think for any writer to reference ancient Greek mythology now and expect to be understood is an intellectual arrogance or nonsense. We have the new mythology, we have the new gods, we have the new stories, the new myths. Our superheroes are the demiurges and the demigods, and absorb stuff from previous mythology and make it new and relevant. I also don't read a lot of SF, except when I do, when it's kind of in disguise. Tally Thompson's Rosewater, terrific, and a deserved winner of the Arthur C. Clarke Award. And the thing I read most recently that had that again, I want to do that, was Richard Powers' The Overstory, which won the Pulitzer Prize, which is science fiction all the way through. It's but you don't actually know it. So it's there's a lot of stuff out there, and yet again, I want to go beyond what's being pushed at me, if you know what I mean. I mean, I want to go somewhere else and discover something new.
Asking what is influencing me now, I think, is just, to me, it's the same question as what am I reading now?
It is.
Because if something, if I'm 10 pages in and I don't feel somewhat involved and therefore influenced, I'm going to put it down. Life's too short. But life's too short to keep up with the fire hose of material is coming out of the science fiction and fantasy community, let alone the other fire hose that comes at me through the gaming community, which is just exploding. I read a trilogy starting with the title Dust recently, and that some would argue, oh, that's not really science fiction because you can break the science in it. So what? Good story, asks good questions. I'm reading a lot of David Weber. There's the spiritual successor to E.E. Smith.
Yeah.
That is Boom Pow Space Opera. I like Boom Pow Space Opera. And we're getting a dose of politics in there too. The C.S. Forrester references are fun. Oh, I'll stop. I could go on.
If you want a specific book, and I've only thought of this because
Please,
of what...
please do mention, I'm fairly sure the audience would like to go and read these books as well. So.
Well, because of what Ian said, there actually was a book out a year or so ago that did deal with the gods of Greek mythology, and it was called Circe by a writer named, I think it's Marion Miller, and she'd written a previous book called The Song of Achilles, about Achilles, and she's doing that. But it's an incredibly good, it's Mary Renault for now. Yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful book, and that had an influence on me.
Yeah.
Great books.
So we are slowly but surely, as always, running out of time, but I'm wondering if we could maybe, if there is a microphone, we could do some audience questions here as well. I'm not saying I'm running out of questions, but just in case there are people in the audience who would like to ask questions. It's very difficult to see from here.
It's hard
know,
to see
it
because
is,
they never
really.
turned the lights
Do
on.
we have a mic?
There is a gopher with a
Here
mic.
it comes.
Do you have any audience questions? It's very difficult to see from there. There is one right there. Yes. Just.
I'd love to know if there's anything that you've read that you'd recommend not to read. Something that sticks out in your mind, or a particular author or series of books or whatever.
Almost
That's
pictures
such a matter of
capitalism.
personal taste.
It really, you know, when I came up here, I said, all right, all those things you don't want to talk, you shouldn't say, and I shoved them out. Now I can't find them. Oh, dear.
I think it's the kind of thing you forget about fairly quickly.
Yeah, truly.
It is a matter of personal taste. A lot of people love the Neil Stephenson, the giant books. I could not do it, but I wouldn't say to somebody else, don't try it, you know.
Yeah, there's really such a variety of tastes. I could, but I shan't name some books that I didn't personally enjoy because I think there was merit in them, and I won't tell you not to read them.
So no help there, in other words.
No, sorry about that.
I read, I've forgotten the name of the author, she's a Canadian author. It was called How Should a Person Be? And it's She is the most detestable, egotistical person I have ever, and it's all first person, but it's absolutely the voice of online culture these days. So it's a terrific book about a thoroughly vile person. So I hated it. I thought, that's brilliant at the same time.
I mean, you know, the funniest thing, it just now occurred to me, it would be simpler for me to talk about that in terms of fanfic than it would be actually in terms of profic. I spend a lot of time in AO3, and there are times when pieces of fiction that, having read them, there are two stages of this. Either you sit back and you go, well, there's 20 minutes I'll never see again. Or alternately, the fics that give you the urge to print them out and bind them so you can throw them at the wall. They're mercifully few. It's surprising how good the writing is by and large.
Let me ask a question about that. Have you read fanfics that made you say that person should be writing for reals?
Oh yeah. Oh, yeah, and more than for real.
Have you ever been able to do anything about it?
I can answer that really quickly.
Please.
It came up yesterday also in my interview. One of the things, the question was posed, what was I most proudest of? And my husband was interviewing me. I said, that's like saying, old woman who lives in the shoe, which of your too many children do you like best?
Oh, really?
So I hit him. I did a lot of media tie-in. I did 17 original Quantum Leap novels and one guide, and I went to the conventions, I bought the fanzines, and I approached the best of the fanzine writers and offered them the opportunity to write licensed books. If they could come up with a pitch for a story, because they had to be within certain guidelines.
Sure.
And I published maybe 10 or 11 fanfic, Quantum Leap fanfic writers. Some of them went on to write other books. Some of them only ever had that one book published. But I'm really very proud of that. That was one of the things I enjoyed most doing. One of them is here today.
And you should be proud. Thank you for doing that. That is so brilliant. God. Yeah.
Awesome.
Have you ever helped a fanfic writer?
Often in ways that are probably better not discussed because, well, no, because it's between, you and them and the muse, really.
That's true.
But all the time I'm running across voices that I just sit there going, this person is already a better writer than I will ever be. And you sit there and go, oh, God. Yeah, and sometimes it's true, and you learn to kind of sit with that, and your job is to tell them they're terrific. That's really it.
Do we have any other do not read recommendations? Or, shall we take another question from the audience?
Here's a question.
There's a question.
What is the one novel of speculative fiction that you have reread the most number of times?
Ooh, Jack Finney's Time and Again.
Le Guin, Always Coming Home.
Oh, good one.
Somebody said, who radicalized you? I said, Ursula Le Guin.
Would be Beam Piper's Lord Calvan of Other Wind. I'd just go back to that.
Le Guin's The Dispossessed.
Yeah. Another one I bounced the first time and had to come back to. Yeah.
I don't think I reread books very often. Can't think of one. There's just so many books to read.
For me, it's probably Jack Vance. Such a stylist, such interesting ideas. And some years ago, there was a project to produce the Vance Integral Edition, an approved set of texts. So Vance was published in paperback, he was published in magazines, his texts were edited, corrupted, rewritten in many places. And this was an all-volunteer project, again, arranged on the internet, to take the best versions of his work, run them by Vance and his son and his wife, and produce a set of volumes. And it came out as 40 volumes, and I subscribed to it. I was one of the early subscribers, and I have that 40-volume set. And even though I'd read a number of the books more than once, I read through the entire set volume by volume. And they're all standalone books, in case you think I'm going back on what I said earlier. But Vance was such a great writer in the short novel form, just the ideas he packed in. So I'd have to say, if I reread anything, it's Jack Vance.
I read Time and Again every time there's a blizzard in New York. So.
Okay, any other audience questions? There is a person with a mic. There is a question. There's a person with their hand up there.
I was wondering if the panel could recommend anything that they considered to be overlooked classics.
What was the question?
Sorry?
So books that that don't get as much attention as you feel that they should, that you'd recommend to people.
Apart from our own, you mean?
Your own books, is that what you said?
No, any books.
No,
Are
no.
overlooked, yeah.
John M. Ford, The Dragon Waiting.
Oh, yes.
Yes.
But it's out of print.
Well, yeah,
mean-
yeah.
I mean, that's a digressive, sad story. Mike's family was so down on what he was doing, they control his literary estate, and they won't let any of his work be reprinted.
Which,
We've talked about some of what's now called the golden age of science fiction.
Sure.
Yes, the societal attitudes, the sexism, perhaps possibly racism. There's some of that, but and in many cases just in passing because those are the mores of the time. But I think if you can overlook that, rereading some of the classic authors, you realize how good they were, even if their work perhaps wouldn't be written the same way today. So think about some of those earlier authors and sample them at least if you haven't done.
Anything else?
I'm hoping nothing of Bob Shaw or John Brunner go out of print.
Oh, really?
Too late for that, I think.
Here's a question. What about guilty pleasure reads? That you may not make you sound the most erudite, but gosh, they're fun to read.
Well, going back to the Quantum Leap program, I like media. I think there's a lot of media tie-in stuff that is really fun to read. It is looked down on somewhat by the writing community, and I think that's unfair because, yes, you're playing in someone else's sandbox, but you still have to come up with an original story, and it has to do all the good things that an original story would do, and you still have to sit your butt in the chair and write it. So I would say, I can't point to a specific thing, but, the various kinds of media tie-ins.
I was on an Octocon years ago, and Ian Watson was there in the book room, and he said, buy that book, and I can't remember the title of it, but I bought the book. Someone can help me out there. And what it is, it's set on a planet for actors. It's an actor world planet. Basically, the entire place is a giant rada for actors, where galactic actors, this place is guarded by warships. Because these actors can change shape and become any character they wish to be. And so therefore, they are the most dangerous people in the universe because they are such great. It's about 150 pages, and it just burns through. It's full of ideas, and this Shakespearean subplot emerges. It's all these shape-shifting actors, going through these kind of murderous Shakespearean machinations. And thankfully, it's a terrific book, and I cannot remember the title of it. And if anyone can find it, or the title, it's a damn good read, actually. I got to the end and said, I enjoyed that. I shouldn't have, but I did.
Okay.
I'll go.
I sort of enjoy the fantasy, and I really have enjoyed the books of Kelly Armstrong, Patricia Briggs, and Carrie Vaughan. Great
The
fun,
urban fantasy.
I mean, so you got werewolves, you got vampires, you got all of those things. A lot of people, Bill calls it my rubbish. Yes, he does. But I do enjoy them, and those are three, I think, of the best writers. I really enjoyed Carrie Vaughan's Kitty series.
Yeah.
It's really fun.
Now, those urban fantasy, because it partook a tad of the romance, there was a line to walk between it, paranormal romance. Well, we think our genre is looked down on. Be a romance writer.
Yeah.
It's sometimes looked down on, but again, the really creative world building, it's the kind of, they're in our world. They're really good stories. They're good characters. They tell a good story. And I loved urban fantasy and certain amounts of paranormal romance, quite frankly.
Yeah. There's one series.
Three really good writers.
Yeah, I need to go back and reread it. It's been too long. Pat Keneally Morrison's Celtic SF trilogy, The Copper Crown, and the two books that follow it. It's Celts in Space.
Yes,
How can you go wrong? You know?
That's actually what they called it in-house, Celts in Space.
Yeah, a great series, delightful.
This is how I learned about the books I want to read.
Yeah.
But you know, they say the golden age of science fiction is 12,
Yes.
whatever you read as
Yeah.
a teen. And I do sometimes go back, and they also talk about the suck fairy having got to a lot of these works. But I do go back and reread some things. You know, some things are out of print, some are hard to find. Some are not even science fiction, like the Swallows and Amazons, the Arthur Ransom series.
Yeah.
Which, again, to me was complete fantasy. How could a bunch of kids go off on a boat in the Lake District by themselves and have adventures? You know, just about the horse books, there's much fantasy.
Yeah.
So, but I think it is worth revisiting those things from your childhood and seeing, you know, can you see what you saw in them then, or are they really dreadful now? I mean, in many cases, this was really fine writing. E. Nesbitt also,
Sure.
something we mentioned earlier.
I go back to Doc Smith occasionally.
Yeah.
And specifically because I want to be 12.
Good point, yeah.
And sometimes it takes, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes you'll hit one sentence, and you'll just go, oh, for God's sake, later. We'll talk about this later. Women aren't like that. You know, and sometimes it's fine. Because some of his aliens are quite wonderful and very
Well, he
enjoyable.
was writing for his time, too.
You know, there's only so much string I'm willing to cut someone for
fair
that,
enough,
frankly, you know.
But the old Flash Gordons, you know, I mean, Dale Arden was such a wimp in the old Flash Gordon films. And the modern Dale is much, much better.
Steve, any guilty pleasures for you when it comes to reading?
If it was, the only thing that would make me feel guilty about something I was enjoying would be wasting my time, and then I'd put it down. So not really. I can try to get into the spirit of the question. Early Laurel Hamilton. I don't think it was making me a better person, but it was fun to read.
Early Laurel Hamilton was the good Laurel Hamilton,
Yes.
says the editor who Laurel Hamilton fired.
Whoa, ow. Let's go to the bar. I want to hear more of this.
So we only actually have 5 more minutes left, but I actually want to ask one final question from the panelists. And for this one, I do want to have actual titles, but what are you reading right now? What is the book that is in your suitcase or e-reader or whatever? Or if you've just finished something.
All the time.
It is in the room. There is, and I understand it's in other cities besides New York, there's a community efforts that are little library shelves outside coffee houses in parks where you can leave a book and take a book.
Yeah. Good idea.
Which answers the question of, you know, people hate to throw books away. And I picked up a copy of, is it Curtis Setterfield is her name? She wrote a book called Prep, but this particular one is called An American Wife, and it's about Laura Bush. It's a disguised biography of Laura Bush, and I've always been curious about it, and it was there, and it was free.
Yeah.
She's considered a literary writer.
I'm going to jump in quickly. So I'm reading a play called The Sweet Science of Bruising, and it's about the secret underground world of Victorian women's boxing. And now you want to read that too as well.
There's too much there.
A play.
I keep so much ebook material with me.
I thought you had an actual
No, that's back in the room. Okay. Right now, I've been rereading Pride and Prejudice, so not really science fiction as such. I've got the Screw Tape Letters in here that's hot at the moment.
You've got a lot of interesting.
Yeah, the Worm Ouroboros. Oh, please. And then there's all this smut, right? And
Hey, there was a horse I saw.
who was that? That's the Middle Kingdom, one of the Middle
Oh, it's your
Kingdom's
book.
stories. Yeah, it's the woman who falls.
Diane has a book of her own.
Of course no, this is where I copy edit.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that later. But no, this is about the woman who makes the mistake of getting into a fight with the sea and winning, and it falls in love with her. And so it shows up on her doorstep and starts pitching her woo in various shapes until it gets it right. That's the first shape it tries, is the good-looking black horse that comes running out to you over the water. Then, sort of about 2 weeks, when that is obviously unworkable, then you get the good-looking guy, like, clothes? What clothes? And we take it from there. So, you know, as I said, it's mud. What about you, Bill?
Bill?
I'm reading Jasper Ford at the moment. So,
Or Jasper for 40.
For 40.
Yeah.
In fact, his father was treasurer of the Bank of England. You find his signature on early banknotes.
Yeah.
But anyway, just Jasper Ford. I kind of like his stuff. It's again, it's some of it's in a series. Some of they're mostly standalone. The one I'm reading on was Early Riser, which I've just started, so I won't tell you what it's about. But I like quite a lot of his books. He's not written enough of them, really. I mean, he starts a series, again, not a series that needs to be continued book by book, but he's got a couple of them where people have been waiting for a while, which sounds familiar, right? So other authors do that too.
Okay, well, at the moment, because I'm traveling, I have it on my phone. I'm reading the Nightstone trilogy, which is a humongous book. Humongous, 3 books. They're all long. These are books Bill would not read because they're too long. I prefer paper books, and I have a paper book with me from, I forget who it is now because I'm not.
It's one of a series you're reading.
It's one of a series I'm reading. When I find something, I like to read things in series, and I'll go to my local library and ask for the book, and if I can't, Bill looks for it for me online, and I try to read them in sequence because a lot of times, even if it's a series, it's nice to start with the first story so you can get the background on the characters and follow through with them.
Yeah.
But this is what I'm reading at the moment, and I'm only about halfway through it. But it's not bad.
Steve?
In Chicago is a very good bookstore in the airport called Barbara's. And when I fly through Chicago, I always visit their science fiction aisle, and that's where I picked up Neil Stephenson's Anathem, that one. But what they had for me this time was the end of a David Weber et al. Trilogy, and that's my airline reading right at the moment.
Wow, sounds wonderful. But I think we are now actually officially out of time, so I'm actually gonna go back to what Mary said earlier when you're talking picture books, which really kind of stuck with me. And I think this is something that we can probably all agree on. You said please give me the words. And I thought that was just a very, very beautiful thing to say. And I think we can probably all agree that that's what we do. We want the words. Some of you create them, and all of us read them, definitely. So I would like to thank you, everybody. First of all, thank you to the audience for being here, asking interesting questions, and thank you for all the guests of honor for being here and being such interesting panelists.
And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, yeah.